Hi, women of welcome. How are you? We are going to be talking about what is going on in Del Rio. We have lots and lots of questions from some of you over on Facebook. We have lots and lots of questions from some of you over on Instagram. So we're going to talk about this. And as soon as Matt switches over to World Relief, we are going to join Matt with us to talk about this. And so honestly, folks, we've got just a short amount of time to do this, so we're going to cover as much ground as possible. The fact of the matter is it appears that the nations are at our doorstep. And if you follow World Relief, if you follow Women of Welcome, you know that we've talked about those migrating from Central America and Mexico, and more recently our allies and refugees who are fleeing from Afghanistan. Just a few weeks ago, we were talking about Cubans that were coming and needing to come. And now we're talking about Haiti. So the reality is that people from around the world are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, and they are driven by political instability, corruption, natural disasters, and economic needs, and doing so in increasing numbers, and Americans are concerned. So I'm going to be joined with by World Relief, and let's see here. Matt Sorens is going to come on here just really quickly. So honestly, the images that we have seen in the news of overwhelmed Border Patrol agents and mistreated migrants is just devastating. Matthew's going to join us here. And of course, we're also hearing the all too familiar narratives from cable news and partisan pundits that describe migration, and all of that. What is happening right now is an invasion of the United States, and that is happening as a result of open border policies from the current administration. So one thing to note, neither of these narratives, open border policies or the invasion narrative, are accurate, nor are they helpful for the kind of conversation that we need to be having about immigration in this country. So these stories from each of these individual people are vastly more complicated than one simple one-liner. And there are historical and regional context and history that is important to understand about what are the push and what are the pull factors. And it's also incredibly important that we remember that each and every one of these individuals is made in the image and likeness of God. And so while we will never advocate for illegal immigration, and while we know that we cannot take everyone here in the United States, what we can do is we can respond as Christ would, and that is to have mercy and compassion, and that we do not have to sacrifice secure and safe borders for compassionate treatment of people who are made in the image of God. So Matt, we're going to try and cover things in 25 minutes, and we've got a lot of ground to cover because there's been a lot of questions. So if you know someone who's got questions about Haiti or is listening to one certain narrative, we at Women of Welcome never jump in on the first day, because we are evaluating, talking with our partners, reading news stories so that we can give you the most accurate, up-to-date, nonpartisan, biblical perspective about what is happening along the border and in terms of immigration and those who are migrating here. So Matthew Sorens, World Relief, good to see you once again, friend. Here we are. Just seemed like a couple weeks ago we were talking about Cuba and Afghanistan, and here we are again. So let's talk about this. What is happening right now? What do we know about stats and who's coming and why? I'll let you jump in on this one.
Yeah, I mean, most people have probably seen some of the images, both of large numbers of people under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas, and some specific images of people being apprehended in really, troubling images. There's people from various parts of the world who have long been coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, of course, but what we have seen in the last week or so is a significant uptick in people specifically from Haiti.
Right.
So the majority of the people who are in this sort of encampment in Del Rio, Texas, which, to be very honest with you, Bree, I've spent a lot of time thinking about immigration and been to the border in a number of places. I'd never heard of Del Rio, Texas. It's not the most, it's not the place where we typically see the large numbers of people showing.
Yeah, we were all kind of like, Del Rio, what in the world? Okay.
Well, and that's, I think, part of the challenge is in other parts of the U.S.-Mexico border, there is more capacity, both governmentally and non-governmentally, in terms of churches and ministries that are used to, significant number of people showing up and requesting asylum. Mm-hmm. And there's some capacity there, but a lot less. And that's part of the challenge of where you've seen a really large number of people show up in a fairly short period of time. And that's not to excuse our government's response to this at all, because frankly, we could have learned from the Panamanians that people from Haiti were crossing through there a month or so ago. I mean, that's how these processes work. It's a long journey. And most of these folks, interestingly, weren't coming directly from Haiti. Obviously, it's an island, or, it's part of an island. And most of these people were coming out from South America, who've been out of Haiti for, in many cases, not all, but many cases, a number of years. So there was some evidence that our government should have been paying more attention to, that this was forthcoming. But it is, I think the way you started talking about this is really important. It is a crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis. That's really different than like a security crisis. This is a lot of families in desperate circumstances who have come out of desperate circumstances, and that's why they are trying to seek, opportunity and hope, and in some cases protection in the United States. But that's really different than a security crisis where people are coming in with the intention to do harm or that sort of thing.
Yeah, so talk to us just about, I can do it or you can do it. I feel like I'll just pitch it over to you. This has been something that has been boiling for over a decade. Back in 2010, they had a magnitude 7 hurricane or earthquake, right? You don't measure hurricanes in magnitude. But they've had all these natural disasters that then made them migrate to Central and South America for jobs, mostly South America. And so we're seeing people come up from Brazil and from Chile. And this isn't just people just coming from Haiti. So give us a little bit historical context as to why people and why now.
Yeah, you're right that, tragically, Haiti has gone through a really, really hard, been more than a decade, certainly. It was already a complicated situation with extreme poverty. It's, I think it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But you had the earthquake in 2010, and in some ways the country has not recovered from that in certain ways. And then you had a series of both, ongoing extreme poverty and additional national disasters, including Hurricane Matthew several years ago, and then another earthquake in Lakai just a month or so ago, with a long history of, there's a lot of injustice in Haiti's history as well. And I think that's even the larger context to this. And then political instability, their president was assassinated just a few months ago. Like, that's a pretty, that doesn't happen, thankfully, very often around the world. And it's a country that has just suffered incredibly. And I think it's really important to keep in mind, as you said, each of these individuals is a person made in the image of God, whom God loves. There's also an incredibly vibrant church in Haiti. And that's one thing at World Relief we really want to, highlight, as we've been on the ground in Haiti for many years, working with local churches. And there are a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of resilience and a lot of strength and a lot of creativity. And, that there's churches in Lakai where the earthquake hit. Again, most of the people at the border left before that earthquake happened, but who are helping address the root causes that are leading people to feel that they don't have any choice except for to get out of the country. So the folks who are at the border, in most cases, many of them left after 2010, or, in the fallout of that. Some of them went to Brazil because of the Olympics. There were jobs there. Others went for other economic opportunities, but they haven't found a safe, permanent place to be. And the United States still has this reputation, which we don't always earn, but, have earned just in a partial way, as being a place of opportunity and safety for people fleeing hardship, fleeing persecution. Our laws are a little bit more complex than that. Hardship and persecution are not exactly the same, and you do have to demonstrate a credible fear of persecution to qualify for asylum under U.S. law. There's almost certain that many of these people could prove that if they had the chance to get their day in court, and also almost certain that some of them wouldn't be able to prove that they are really fleeing things that I would probably flee as well, in terms of extreme poverty, but not necessarily a credible fear of persecution for a reason of law. What we've tried to say at World Relief consistently, whether it's Haitians or Cubans or Central Americans or whoever, is that we need due process and access to our asylum laws. That is to say, right now, people are being sent back in some cases, not in all cases, under something called Title 42, which is a public health law, without being given the chance to apply for asylum. And that is
going to be repealed, right? In the next.
Yeah, this is how, it changes day to day, but about a week ago, a court ruled that the U.S.'s use of Title 42 for families in particular was not lawful, and that the Biden administration has to stop it.
Right.
However, they gave them 2 weeks to do so.
Right.
So with this crisis in Del Rio in particular, they are using Title 42 still to expel a significant number of people. Now this gets complicated because other people, and it almost depends which cable news channel you watch, which story you hear, you will also hear that some people are being allowed into the United States. They're dispersing to usually to family in different parts of the U.S. with a notice to report to immigration court because they want to seek asylum. Both of those are true. Just some people are getting a chance to enter the asylum process, and some people are not being given that chance. And our view is that we should have due process for everyone. It doesn't mean everyone gets to stay, but everyone gets to avail themselves to the protections that are offered by U.S. law.
Okay, so some of the real, there are a couple of key things that you said that we don't necessarily have time to dive into today, but I mean, the U.S. is responsible for a lot of the political and economic hardships that are happening in these surrounding countries. A lot of our involvement has positive and negative effects on the people and the jobs and the governments and the stability of these places. And so there's a real deep historical and political context that we need to take into account and have ownership of. But that's for a whole nother conversation. The other thing you talked about is that there is a bit of a disparity as far as who's being allowed to seek asylum and who's being deported. The bottom line is not everyone is being let in, and that not everyone is being deported. But we have seen reports from the Washington Post and also from the Associated Press that there are thousands of people being let in, and then there's thousands of people a day who, or at least up to 1,000 people a day, who are being put on deportation flights back to Haiti. And maybe they haven't been to Haiti in 10 years, but that is their nationality. So they are going back to that place because they cannot stay where they are. And so I think that we always have to hold these things in tension. I mean, there's not there is some ambiguity as to processing along the border. And so unfortunately, it's not always this uniform way of processing people. And so some people are being allowed to seek asylum and go through that process, which when we're seeing people come onto the banks of Del Rio and we're seeing them looking to try and approach the border, seeking asylum is a legal way to come into the U.S. And it gets tricky. We talk about this a lot, about how you have to come into the U.S. to claim asylum, to seek asylum, but you have to enter sometimes illegally, meaning without status. And so that can be kind of confusing, but that is the legal way to seek asylum. So I think some people are pretty concerned about some of the imagery that we have seen about the pressure that has been on the Border Patrol, but then also just the pressure that has been on those who are trying to come up on the shore. Can you talk to us just a little bit about why are we seeing some of these really disturbing images? What is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really clear is, of course, the Border Patrol has a job to do. In fact, most of these, if you're looking for asylum, you're looking for the Border Patrol. Right. That's your opportunity to interact with U.S. government and request asylum. Mm-hmm. And there may be some who are trying to sort of sneak into the country, but frankly, when you are joining a mass of people just kind of think logically here. Clearly, these are not people trying to sneak into the United States. You don't go in a huge crowd thinking that you're going to sneak into the country. Right. They are under the impression, sometimes with some degree of grain of truth, sometimes just misled by a smuggler or someone, that they may be allowed to stay in the United States. Again, the grain of truth there is our asylum process. For certain individuals who can prove a credible fear of persecution, they have the right under U.S. law, Section 208 of the Immigration Nationality Act, regardless of their mode of entry. Meaning, if you enter the country without a visa, you still have the right to request asylum under the law. Mm-hmm. But with Title 42, that's not being universally followed. But I think one of the challenges, and this might get ahead of us to sort of solutions on a policy basis, is it would be much better if people could go walk up to the port of entry and say, I'm here to request asylum. And what's been happening for a number of years, and this actually started with Haitians in Tijuana back in 2016. So the dynamic of Haitians arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border to seek asylum is not new. Is people are being told, well, we don't have space to process your asylum claim here. So a number of people figured out, go, cross the border, and then they basically have to deal with you. Yeah. And of course there are smugglers and that sort of dynamic who exploit that situation as well. They give people information that is not accurate. Their motivation is profit, and they are going to tell people what they need to tell them to be able to profit off the situation. Yeah. But having a functional asylum process at the border would go a long way to minimizing the disorder and just the inhumane conditions. That said, we also need to really hold the government accountable to making sure that the Border Patrol treats people humanely, even when they need to apprehend them. Some of the images, and not just images, but if people watch the video, the words coming out of Border Patrol agents were really offensive. And I mean, I think that's very troubling to see. But also, obviously, some of the actions were troubling. But the best way to address this, of course, accountability is important there, but is to have a functional asylum process. And even beyond that, a functional process for immigration that doesn't require you to get to the U.S. border. Because asylum is only possible if you're within or at the border of the United States.
Right.
That's the law. But if we had a more robust refugee resettlement program, you could request a refugee status, which is basically proving the same thing as asylum, that you have a credible fear of persecution, closer to home. And frankly, if you're fleeing poverty, but not violence, but there's a job available in the United States, if we had a more functional work-based visa system, you could go to the consulate in Port-au-Prince or whatever your country of origin is. And that's not something you can do without limits, but frankly, the U.S. has incredible labor shortages right now. We could benefit, even beyond the humanitarian dynamics of this, the U.S. would benefit from a more robust legal immigration process. And that would go a long way to sparing people the disorder that we're seeing right now, and the chaos and the human suffering there along the border.
So just to recap a little bit, yes, people are being, there are some people who are being allowed in the current asylum processing that we do have. So it's not that there's anybody along the border who's just like opening up a gate and saying, yeah, come on in. That's not how that works. And the truth is that there are people who are being deported on flights. And so there is a both and dynamic. So when you see those headlines, know that we do have, for the most part, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but we do, for the most part, have a secure border. Of course, ever since the history of our borders in our country, we have seen illegal immigration, but we do have a very robust border patrol and security system in place. And you've seen, some people were like, I've never seen border patrol on horseback. Is that a new thing? No, it's not new. Border patrol has all kinds of tools at their disposal. They've got ground sensors, they've got cameras, they've got drones, they've got people on horseback, they've got ATVs, they've got trucks, they've got man on foot. So depending where you are around the border, there are different means and tools that the government uses to enforce security. Is that 100% perfect? No, but you're not seeing anyone open up a door and saying, yes, this is open borders according to the current administration. So I think that's important to let people know that we do have a robust security system across the border. And you are seeing this both and dynamic of, okay, some people are being deported, some people are being let in to go through that process.
Yeah, that's accurate. And I think, people have probably seen in the last few months, we have had very high numbers of Border Patrol apprehensions of people who have crossed the border unlawfully without authorization. That doesn't mean that they are sneaking into the country. That means they are being apprehended. Sometimes when you report these numbers, you have sort of the numerator of how many people are being apprehended. You don't necessarily have the denominator of how many people are trying to cross. But the Department of Homeland Security's best, estimates are they're either apprehending or deterring, that is to say, sort of people are going back because they're about to be caught. The significant majority of people, the large majority of people. And again, part of that is the shift that we've seen over a decade or so, where it used to be that it was more common for people to try to basically surreptitiously enter the country, like get past the Border Patrol, go get in the United States, find a job, most people, seeking economic opportunity. That's gotten very, very difficult because of increases to border security and personnel and technology. And also the reasons that people are coming are more varied. There's always been people fleeing persecution, and there's always been people fleeing poverty. But we have seen upticks in violence in some cases that have meant more people are coming with that goal of seeking asylum because of a fear of persecution. And then again, you have other people who really, they think they're there to seek asylum, but they don't understand U.S. immigration law particularly well, which is not a criticism because frankly, most Americans do not understand U.S. immigration law very well either. It's incredibly complicated, but people have often been fed misinformation from smugglers or that sort of thing. And obviously in this case with the Haitians, clearly this was a fairly organized effort that a large number of people were transported through Mexico in a fairly short amount of time. And not just through Mexico, through Central America, all the way up through Panama from South America in most cases.
Yeah, and I mean, whenever migration happens and there's either a big caravan or something like that that's approaching the border, my inbox is just flooded with videos of folks claiming human smuggling is happening and trafficking is going on and whatnot. And I guess it's one thing to I think we should just touch base on that. It's just the reality is that wherever migration of people is happening, people are vulnerable to trafficking. Yeah. And that is just something that is married in. That's one of the tentacles of what comes out of those who are migrating, because they are vulnerable. They don't have their regular support systems in place in order to protect them. And so, of course, that is happening. But that doesn't mean our government isn't aware of those things. It doesn't mean that they're not privy to investigating that and knowing that people are going to be exploiting them. I mean, the reality is that our immigration system and our refugee asylum seeking system is so disjointed right now that what we're doing is we're giving cartels and smugglers and those who would take advantage of migrants an opportunity to get wealthy and to get rich and to take advantage of more people. And so when we don't advocate and hold our elected officials responsible for actually creating a functional system, this is going to continue to happen. What would you say to that, Matt?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's very much true. I mean, that's why we think it's so important to have a robust, functional legal system that offers people with a credible fear of persecution, and frankly, people, who are looking for opportunity, economic opportunity, fleeing poverty. I mean, again, the refugee resettlement program isn't perfect, but it's actually very orderly once people arrive here. The Afghan situation is sort of a unique exception with a lot of, the evacuation. But in general, if you're resettled as a refugee, you land at an airport. And World Relief, or another refugee resettlement agency, has set up an apartment for you, with a few weeks' notice before you arrived, and we've got a team from a church there to welcome you. It's a much better process than having to make your way across sometimes several countries and being vulnerable to exploitation. Again, you have a lot of children in these situations, a lot of women, a lot of men as well, but it's far from an ideal situation. But the solution to that situation is not just to turn those vulnerable people away or mistreat them. It's to say, how do we fix the situation for the long term? And at the same time, how do we humanely respond to the people who are right in front of us?
Right. Okay. So that gets us to just two or three more questions before we're going to get off here. But we're trying to kind of lump people's questions. We have so many of them into just kind of some very, very broad strokes and generalities here. But one of the questions is, and we've talked about this before, but those who are allowed to go through the process, and they're in country, they're being let in to go through the process. That means that they have gone through some initial screening and they are being connected with immigration and offices here in government offices here in the U.S. Once they arrive here, there's been a lot of questions about the strain that this is putting on the state of Texas and how do we help support this burden that's on Texans. And so either one of us, I'll just pitch it over to you. So when people are allowed in, who is responsible for them while they await their court hearings? Who is taking care of all of their needs? And is this really a big, huge lift for Texas taxpayers, or is it a federal budget issue?
I mean, for the most part, it's not either. In that, I mean, the majority of Haitians who come in, and this is true of Central Americans as well, who are allowed into the United States under some sort of an alternative detention program while they await an asylum hearing, they're going to go live with family in the vast majority of cases. And that's because there's a really significant Haitian population in the United States. There's a significant Salvadoran and Guatemalan and Honduran population. So most people have somebody who they are, who can welcome them.
And if they don't,
in some cases, and that's all over the United States, not in the border region for the most part. I mean, very few of those families happen to live within a few miles of the U.S.-Mexico border.
And if they
so
don't
they come
have family,
to Chicago, where I'm at, and they go to Los Angeles, and they go to Seattle, and they go to Boston. So it distributes across the United States. And when you distribute this number of people across the United States, it's not actually a huge number of people. Now, there are costs to taxpayers, and actually the most expensive thing is detention. That is, when the federal government detains people, they spend more than $100 per night per detainee, and a lot of that they do directly as a government. Some they do as contracts to corporations that run detention centers and have contracts with the federal government. That ends up being a lot more expensive, actually, than an alternative detention where you're letting families or nonprofits or churches care for people while they're waiting for that asylum process. Which, one of the problems is that the asylum process takes so incredibly long. So even when people have a good case, it could take a very long time before they're formally authorized to work. And that's the thing, there's been proposals to address that situation as well. But we are, through World Relief, and where we have the resources, we're serving asylum seekers in communities throughout the United States. and connecting them to teams from churches wherever we can as well.
So I'm going to ask just a couple questions before we get to the very last one, which is what do we need to do? But I had a good question, just, you know, individuals who are showing up, why doesn't the U.S. have more like organized refugee camps along the border that we see set up by the UN and other countries? Why does the U.S. and the UN not work together to kind of alleviate some of that horrific living across the border towns?
That's a good question. I mean, the UNHCR, which is the UN's refugee agency, has actually had some involvement in Mexico. Part of this gets very complicated because we're dealing with multiple countries and their different laws and their, I mean, one of the challenges with the Haitians actually is Mexico has basically agreed under certain circumstances to take back Central Americans who are expelled under Title 42. That is to say that those, you know, a Guatemalan doesn't necessarily get deported on a plane back to Guatemala. They just get sort of shoved back to Mexico. But Mexico is not treating Haitians in the same way. So the U.S. is in a complicated situation. They can't necessarily send people back to Mexico. Mexico at that point might say, we will not take this person who is not a national of Mexico. I mean, the U.S. has limited options at that point. They can expel people under the authority of Title 42. They believe they can do so, and the courts are letting them do so for another week or so, at least with families. Or they can begin an asylum application. They can also begin an asylum process and determine that, no, this person does not pass a credible fear interview. They really don't have a chance at asylum, and then they can deport them back to Haiti under the normal law. So it's not that the law requires them to let everyone in. It does require them to give due process and what's called a credible fear interview to see if they have a decent chance at winning an asylum case. And the hard reality of the situation in Haiti right now is a lot of these people do have a credible fear of persecution.
Right. Right. Okay, so the last question is the one we most frequently get at Women of Welcome and probably World Relief as well, and that is what can I do? And I think there's long-term things, solutions, and then there's kind of like what can we do today solutions. And we've had a lot of people ask, where can I get involved in Del Rio? Where can I send money? What can I do? And just when we start out this conversation, Matt and I are both kind of like, Del Rio, yikes, like this is kind of like a new pressure point place. And so as of today, right now, we are still trying to figure out who we might direct you to that we feel is vetted and credible in that region. So we don't have someone very specific today in the specific Del Rio area that we would recommend, but we will get back to you on that. What Matt and I would say about that is that World Relief is serving Haitians in other parts of the border. They're serving all kinds of migrants in different areas across the border. And so we would always encourage you to go to Catholic Charities, has several shelters on both sides of the border. Ibarra Frontiers in El Paso, Texas, and Juarez is another great ministry to support. But long-term stuff, Matt, anything else on short-term, but long-term stuff, why don't you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think long-term, part of that is advocacy, encouraging our government to be engaged and address the processes, but also, you know, there's things that the U.S. church can do to come alongside churches in Haiti. And I think, especially right now, even though the earthquake in Lacaille was after most of these people have left, that's part of why it's really, you know, troubling to think that we would be sending people back to an even further devastated situation. And I think that, you know, we happen to be on the ground at World Relief with a number of church empowerment zones, working with local churches in a number of different parts of Haiti, but including in Lacaille, which was like the epicenter of the earthquake. So that earthquake, you know, kind of was like a 2-day news story, kind of overtaken by Afghanistan, but the situation in Haiti is really devastating. I mean, it was an earthquake of a greater magnitude than what happened in 2010. And not in as populous of an area, so not the same level of deaths, fortunately, but still it's incredibly devastating. And not only, you know, in terms of emergency response, but then longer term addressing the economic situation. And there are amazing Haitian church leaders doing incredible work to care for vulnerable people in their community. Our model at World Relief is to come alongside them and help equip them with resources. So we would love, I mean, that I think is at the long term, we need to.
Matt, I think you cut out. I can't really hear you. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. You were explaining long-term coming alongside Haitian churches. I mean, the reality is we could see more Haitians coming up and migrating if we don't get involved in country. And that's the same as in Central America. That is the same in all of these places that we talk about. It's like, okay, why are we seeing this flood of people? Because there's instability in country. So part of the long-term strategy is to get engaged in country efforts and actually encourage the government to be involved in country efforts as well. When we talk about engaging our elected officials, we're talking about calling those who are elected in your state, particularly your congressman, to say, hey, I want immigration reform. We need a long-term functioning immigration system. What does that look like, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of that is looking at future flow of migration and making sure that we have orderly, lawful processes, both for those fleeing persecution, for those who are seeking economic opportunity and meeting a need in the U.S. labor market as well, and then keeping families, together and reuniting families also. You can pair that with, it's appropriate to have secure borders. We've always affirmed that at World Relief. We don't want people sneaking into the country and we don't know who they are. We want a functional legal process. And then you also need a process for people who've been here for a long time, including a lot of Haitians. I mean, you have Haitians who've been here with lawfully present since 2010 when that last earthquake happened, who are stuck in this perpetual temporary status without the chance to get permanent status. And that's a one particular part of the dynamic, but there's a lot of people who we have always said we need the opportunity for people to earn permanent legal status and eventual citizenship who want to become Americans, which most people would be eager to do.
Right. And I think the very last thing that I think we'll say here is that there is no silver bullet solution. I think in America, we're very much like, where do I write the check? How do I get in? Like, what do I do to stop what's happening? And the reality is that immigration is a long-term solution. So if you are not on the regular calling your elected officials and putting pressure on them to have long-term solutions in country in support of surrounding countries so that migration doesn't happen in these huge flows, but that also that you are saying, hey, I'm going to hold you accountable for not working towards a functional immigration system, then that is on us, because there is no silver bullet. I mean, we're really putting a Band-Aid on things when we're just sending money to these wonderful, wonderful shelters and whatnot. But there's just long-term engagement that is needed from the American church. And like we said, the nations are at our doorstep. And how is the church going to respond? And I think we have to dig deep into Matthew 25, verses 31 through 45, and just say, what is my church's role in what Jesus is saying in those verses? What do we need to get involved in? Because this issue is not going away. It's going to continue to happen. So World Relief has an advocacy page. It's a very, very quick to start advocating. You go on worldrelief.com. I think it's /advocacy, or you can get involved and click on advocacy. And there's a plethora of things that you can sign your name to, or scripts that help you know what to say when you call. If you go on womenofwelcome.com, you can see how to get involved and how to contact your elected officials, how to find your elected officials. What do I say? There's equipping pieces on both websites and on both Instagram accounts and both Facebook accounts. So if you're feeling like not sure what to say or who to call, you will find all of that information on Women of Welcome and at World Relief. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Matt. And continue to send your questions into us, and either we'll have a part 2 or we'll put that in our stories to answer as many questions as we can. Thank you so much.
Thanks. We appreciate you taking the time for this.